those who wish to follow him and be obedient. You know, yes, the great Billy Grahams in the past have done some great things. Yes, the Billy Sundays in the past have seen entire nations, perhaps, come to Christ. But just because they are not here does not mean that God is not here. And he can do the same thing yesterday, today, and forever if he chooses. It takes his people who want to stand up and say, God, I will not let you go until you bless me. I'm not going to let you go, God, because I want to wrestle with you. I want to get a hold of you, and I want to know all there is to know about you, because I want to take this world by storm. There are some walls that got to come down, God, and they cannot come down unless you bring them down. So, Israel goes into the promised land, and their first obstacle is Jericho. Now, once again, let me ask you, how big is your God? How big is your God? Because faith looks forward to the future and sees the hand of God at work. And sometimes, faith says, trust in the Lord. He can do much with little. But the world looks at faith and says, that's impossible. It cannot be done. You cannot do much with little. You have to do much with much. You have to get your ducks all in a row. You have to get all lined up. You have to pray real hard. You got to be real this and that and whatever. You know what God says to us this morning? He says, you know what? I want to show you what I can do through you. Though you feel you are nothing, though you feel you have little, I want to do much through you. So, in Joshua chapter 2, verse 8 through 11, this is Rahab. This is Rahab the harlot story. Because there are two things that happen for us in our story this morning, I believe. First of all, Rahab realized that her God was not big. She realized that her God, first of all, was not a big God. For she says this in Joshua, the book of Joshua, chapter 2, verse 8. That says, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up onto the roof, and she said to them, I know the Lord has given this land to you, and that the great fear of you has fallen upon all of us, so that all who live in the country are melting away in fear because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to King Sihon and Og, and the two kings of the Amorites of the east of the Jordan, who were completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is the God of heaven above and of the earth below. Now, it seems that Rahab is a very unlikely candidate for being a part of the heroes of the faith, doesn't it? Okay, because if you look at Rahab's past, look at her resume, per se. First of all, she's a pagan. She's not a believer in God. She's a Canaanite, part of a religion that completely rejects God. As a matter of fact, sets up false gods that are detestable and to put it mildly, totally depraved and evil. This is the background that Rahab comes from. Now, you want to add insult to injury. Not only is Rahab a pagan, not only does she follow pagan gods, she's also a prostitute. Oh, mark it off. You're done for. There is no redemption for that. Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you this. Again, how big is your God? How big is your God? Is he big enough to forgive the seemingly unpardonable sins? Whatever the sin it is, put your own definition in there, whatever it is. Walking away from your family, adultery, abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse, apathy. Put your definition of whatever the unpardonable sin is in the blank. Is God big enough to overcome it? Oh, Pastor, I don't know. That's a big one. I mean, that's big. You don't know what I've done in my life. You're right. Ladies and gentlemen, understand this as well. I know how big God is. I know for a fact how big God is. And I'm telling you, and I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner saved by grace. And I know only this much. But we serve a big and holy and righteous God. She was a Canaanite. She was a pagan. She was a prostitute. Now, how did she know? How did Rahab know that God is the God of heaven and the God of earth? Look at it again in verse 11. When we heard of it, our hearts melted away, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord, your God, is the God of heaven above and of the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that in the process of going through what Rahab went through in her culture, in her religion, there was something about what was going on in the practices of that pagan religion that caused her to stand up and say, wait a minute, that's not right. Because you see, an author one time defined the Canaanites' religion as in this way, and listen to this. The brutality and lust and abandonment of Canaanite gods and religion is far worse than anywhere else in the ancient history and time. The astonishing characteristics of the Canaanite deities that they had no morals, no conscience, and no character whatsoever. It must have brought about the very worst traits in all of their followers. It entailed many of the most demoralizing practices of the time, such as sacred prostitution, child sacrifice, and pagan idol worship. Ladies and gentlemen, I ran across something in the history books that caused my heart just to fail in me. Because the Canaanites, as a part of one of their rituals, when they were building a city, they would take babies, they would take the innocent and bury them in the foundations of their cities and call them building and sacrifices of foundation. They would take the innocent and sacrifice them on the altars of their gods in order to get the favor of their gods. And guess probably what walls were built upon such sacrifices? You guessed it, the walls of Jericho. So I can see in the heart of a righteous and a holy God who puts a bullseye right on the front door of Jericho and says, you know what? You are coming down. Because God is a holy God and he will not stand for unrighteousness for too long. Our God is a big God. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're just upset about the way things are going in our country, if you're concerned about where our nation is heading, let me reassure you, God has not missed 1 second of what's happening. God has not turned a blind eye to what's happening in America and this world. And there's going to come a time when there will be retribution and there will be a calling for an accounting for every single person who's ever lived. Now let me ask you this one more time. How big is God? What does he desire to use and to work in this world through his children? Is he perhaps calling us to be a voice in our community? Is he calling for us to raise our voices and say, you know what? This is not right where we're going. I want to stand for God. Rahab at one time in her life, I think, looked down at the religion that she was a part of. She looked at the culture that she was born into or she was raised in. Perhaps she was a temple prostitute as well. Who knows? But I think she looked into the evil that was around her and she said, I have had it. That's enough. So Rahab realized that her God was not big enough. Her God was nothing compared to the God of gods that was coming. The one who had given the nation victory in Egypt, had given them victory over the kings that were around them. And Jericho was next. There are times in our lives when God shows up and he says, choose who you will serve. Choose for yourself this day who you will serve. Now, interesting side note here. This is just a little extra for you. How many times do you think Rahab is mentioned in the New Testament as an example of faith? How many times do you think? Well, let's go back to a couple other famous ladies in the Scripture. Ruth. The lady Ruth, she was a Moabite. She was a pagan, but again, she followed and she became part of the nation of Israel. Ruth's mentioned one time in the New Testament. How about Esther? Queen Esther, becomes queen, saves the nation of Israel. How many times is she mentioned in the New Testament? 0. Rahab's mentioned 3 times. 3 times in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, Rahab goes on and she marries a man in the nation of Israel and actually becomes the great-grandfather of King David. But, what again? grandmother. I'm sorry, I said grandfather. She becomes the great-great-grandparent.